care to do so. It mattered little to Ron who the proponents of these views were, what power or position they might hold, or what the consequences might be to himself for speaking out against them. Ron had the courage to speak his mind. I'm not saying that Ron was always right, but from my perspective, he was not often wrong. Ron and I met 45 years ago, just down this hallway in what is now configured as the principal's office. When Ron and I arrived, it was a two-room residence. Ron got the living room as his office, I got the bedroom as mine. With the bedroom door open and the positioning of our desks, we could essentially share an office. Unless there was a student visiting one of us, the door was always open. This was when Ron introduced me to what I came to call the open filing system. Ron showed me that if you use all the space on your desk, but really the whole office, to spread out your papers and whatever, that by slowly turning, you could eventually spot what it was you were looking for. Ron was so committed to this system that he used it at home as well. The only problem that Ron had that I could see was that he never seemed to work or live in a space quite large enough. Ron and I were starting our dissertations when we arrived, and that meant we spent our summers in the offices as well. In the afternoon, we'd often slip off to the tennis courts behind the seminary for a breath of fresh air and getting a little exercise. Ron loved to watch competitive tennis, but in his own play, he was totally non-competitive. No scoring, no games, not even any serving, just an hour or two of volleying, enjoying the challenge of hitting one another good shots that the other could return. Ron may have played more competitively with others, I don't know. But with me, it was always simply the enjoyment of a challenging exercise with a friend. Ron also had a wonderful sense of humor and an explosive laugh that some of you may not have heard. Some of my happiest memories of Ron are at dinners with John and Mary Snyder, where we would be rolling with laughter as John and Ron recalled their student experiences at Notre Dame. Although we were a decade apart, Ron and I found that in many ways we were in the same place. Ron had experienced, that this decade was not totally insignificant though. Ron had experienced intensely something that we both grew up with, but that I didn't encounter as an adult until it was already beginning to be challenged, namely the late medieval church. In the 1950s, when Ron entered the seminary, the late medieval church was alive and well, especially in seminaries. It wasn't just that the church had changed very little since those Counter-Reformation Council of Trent days in the 17th century. It had persuaded itself that its structure went back not just to the 17th century, but to St. Peter himself with at most cosmetic changes. The church was unchanging and unchangeable. The hierarchy was the sole reliable source of unchanging eternal truths. In the classical worldview, the more unchanging something was, the more godlike it was, the closer to perfection. The church that Ron so intensely experienced was a church from the age of absolute monarchs, and there was no monarch more absolute than the Pope. All authority was beyond question and was delegated from the top down, from God to Pope to bishops to rectors and pastors and to assistant pastors. Notably absent on that list, the laity. absolute deference was required to anyone above you on this hierarchy. A decade later, my own rector confided in me that previous rectors often felt required to impose irrational requirements on the seminarians so that after ordination, young priests would have learned to deal with the irrational dictates of their pastors. This may be the one instance in which Ron was a slow learner, and dare I say, ineducable. By the time Ron was ordained, the Second Vatican Council was starting to articulate a theoretical basis for change. The Council acknowledged, in a limited way, the legitimacy of an approach to Scripture of certain Protestant scholars who had been working for a century or so. What they had shown was that the Bible was not and could not be the very words of God dictated to human scribes. No one seemed to have asked why God would even have needed human scribes when a couple of stone tablets and a bit of lightning was adequate to give us the Ten Commandments. But be that as it may, these scholars looked at these texts in their original languages and found that they had a very human history, that they reflected different times and places and situations, that they reflected different linguistic styles and perspectives. And this was groundbreaking. For those of you who have not delved into biblical scholarship, let me give you a quick example of the kind of analysis that was going on. If you were a German speaker and you read excerpts from Shakespeare and the Globe and Mail, but only translated into modern German, you might not notice the differences. But as an English speaker, reading those passages in the original English, you could not believe that they were written at the same time in the same place by the same person. For Ron, his career-long passion for historically conscious biblical scholarship shaped not only his teachings and homilies, but his vision for the possibilities for the church. For if the Bible had a history, so too surely did the church. If the church had a history, it had changed. And if it had changed, as church historians increasingly verified, it could change again, and not just in superficial ways. For example, a condemnation of charging any interest on a loan as intrinsically wrong, according to both natural law and the Scripture, was quietly abandoned in the 16th century. For 1,000 years before that, it would have led to excommunication and a denial of Christian burial. This was serious stuff. Another example. Since the earliest centuries, the church issued biblical and natural law-based endorsements of the legitimacy of slavery under certain conditions. In the 19th century, those endorsements were replaced by equally strong condemnations. Ron loved the community that was the church, but Ron knew well that real love doesn't always mean saying you're just fine the way you are, although that would certainly be the easier, safer course to take. Ron was part of a generation of theologians excited by the possibility of contributing to making the church better suited for its mission, a renewal and aggiornamento. Not every possible change would be an improvement, but well-considered changes, tested anew against the underlying values in the Bible, could be. These would be changes that reflected the real experiences of the laity, not just what the hierarchy thought those experiences should be. Ron was among those who saw part of the role of theologians as seeking to enhance the church by identifying what changes should be made and to advocate for them. One example, Ron saw, decades before its wider social acceptance, the church needed to change its condemnation of homosexuality. Yes, the condemnation of homosexuality was based on long-standing biblical and natural law arguments. But recall, so were the condemnation of charging interest on a loan and the endorsement of slavery. The question was, are they compelling arguments, given our current understanding of Scripture and our recognition of the assumptions built into medieval articulations of natural law? Ron, along with many other theologians, saw that these arguments were easily rejected by anyone willing to take the effort to carefully examine them. Lacking compelling biblical or rational support, the condemnation of homosexuality could only be seen as a well-dressed up form of homophobia. Ron, being a courageous, honest man, was not willing to keep these views to himself. The injustice of this condemnation was made clear in Ron's homilies and his other public statements. Resistance to the openness of Vatican II began only a few years after the council closed. At a public lecture in Toronto attended by all of us in the department, Joseph Ratzinger, later to become Pope Benedict, described reform advocating theologians as wolves attacking the sheep. These were dark decades where we felt we were fighting a losing battle to try to keep the vision alive. It was such a joy for me to see the hope and excitement return to Ron's eyes with the papacy of Pope Francis. Coming of age in the 60s, Ron was also deeply committed to and influenced by the civil rights movement. Along with Vatican II, it nurtured in Ron a willingness to challenge powerful forces and conventional ways of seeing how things ought to be. Prejudice for Ron was simply a self-serving collective lie told to groups of people, largely so we wouldn't have to compete with them. Even we modestly gifted might succeed if we could limit our competition to other white male Christian, white male Christians who were straight and born in this country. Ron was enraged by racism, particularly of late when it came from a certain individual who claimed, "I am the least racist person you will ever meet." You know how some people watch exercise shows to get the juices flowing, their heart rate up? For Ron, what seemed to work best was the Rachel Maddow show. If it wasn't for getting worked up about Trump, Ron would have gotten hardly any cardio exercise at all. Ron would remind you of his commitment to opposing racism, not simply by all he said and did, which was formidable, but also by what he wore. Ron never met a Martin Luther King t-shirt he didn't like, or so far as I can tell, didn't buy. When I was helping Ron organize his clothes for his move into the retirement residence, I told him that his Martin Luther King t-shirts outnumbered his Malcolm X t-shirts 18 to 12. Even Ron admitted that was perhaps a few more than he needed. But people could tell where Ron stood on this issue from 10 feet away. Ron didn't last long at that retirement residence for a few reasons, but significant among them was the fact that the cost of living there reduced his ability to make substantial monthly contributions to a whole host of charitable causes. When I asked Ron how he liked moving in with the Castros, Ron said it was, quote, 8,000% better. Ali, Hernan, the love and support that you showed for Ron, particularly in these last difficult times. For this, we are grateful beyond words. Ron's Christianity was rooted not only in the fact that he loved Jesus, Ron really, really liked him. What Ron really liked about Jesus was that he saw through the BS of religious formalism, that he really cared about people, not all of whom were easy to care about, and he was willing to tell the truth, even to those who didn't want to hear it. For Ron, there was little point in obsessing about the divinity of Jesus if we lost sight of his very real humanity. Ron often used to say about Jesus that the most important thing about him was that he got it right. He figured out what a genuinely human life was supposed to look like. And then Ron would no doubt note the barely passing resemblance of that to the lives that we lived. But Ron always stressed the we, insisting that he was no closer to the goal than the rest of us. After setting out a gospel insight into how life should be lived, Ron would often add, "I certainly don't live that way." But Ron was troubled by that, and he hoped that we would be too. The liturgy was central in Ron's life because it was an opportunity for a weekly reconnection with Jesus, and he sought very hard to make that connection as real as possible. When Ron would hold the consecrated bread or cup and move it across the congregation, stopping briefly to make eye contact with each one of us, he was saying that Jesus was there for me, and you, and you, and you. Ron is the only priest I know where it was commonplace to see people taking notes during his homily. I swear there were more notes taken during Ron's homily than in most of my classes. Probably for good reason. Before we arrived at King's, it had adopted a policy that religious faculty would be paid the same as the laity. This was an effective way of countering the temptation to hire religious simply to save money. As Ron's permission to come to King's from his bishop in Illinois was with the understanding that there would be no support or pension from his home diocese, nor would there be any from the Diocese of London. So Ron's financial situation, short-term and long-term, was the same as mine or any of the other single faculty. As our salaries grew over time, Ron had resources that other clergy would not. What is inspiring about Ron is how he used it. After several years of renting an apartment, Ron had saved up enough to make a down payment on a small house. If Ron ever lived there alone, it was for very short periods. It seemed that whenever Ron encountered someone who needed a place to stay, be it for days or weeks or months, his door was open. While volunteering for a year on the seminary faculty in Zambia, Ron realized that he had the resources to adopt a young man who, had he stayed in Zambia, would face very bleak prospects. Not long after Nandwe, there followed Marcelo, and not too long after that, Judney. Looking back on his life, Ron recently told my wife Marg that becoming a father was the best thing he ever did. Still, Ron took on the challenge of single parenting pre-adolescent boys, one with a serious physical challenge, adjusting to a totally new culture with a limited command of the language in lily-white London, Ontario. Knowing all that this entailed, Ron shortly did it again, and then yet again. Because he saw someone who needed help he was in a position to offer, and because he cared deeply about them. While Ron repeatedly insisted that he was no closer to emulating Jesus than the rest of us, I beg to differ. Ron had a passion for teaching and was deeply saddened when this was no longer available to him. His scripture courses transformed the religious worldview of many, though he also endured many attacks from students who were expecting a fundamentalist presentation of the scriptures. His courses on religion in the media dealt not with the depiction of religion in the media, but how films and other media understood and grappled with the problem of evil in our lives. His courses on atheism and faith offered no simplistic refutations of atheism. Ron took atheism seriously, in part, no doubt, because he had gone through a period of atheism himself in his youth. 3.5 weeks ago, I had to leave for 3 weeks in Vancouver. The day before I left, I went to see Ron, and we had an hour alone together. Ron was rested and lucid. When I told Ron how long I would be gone, Ron and I both knew that this was our final goodbye. There was an honesty about it, befitting Ron, that was both painful and a gift. Looking back, Ron said his only regret was not having spent more time with his music. He smiled when I pointed out that as a theologian, he would soon have the answer to some of the big questions we had pondered. We embraced, shed a few tears. I told Ron, speaking not, I think, just for myself, that I loved him and was a better person because he had been a significant part of my life. I also told him that he would not be totally gone, not just in our memories, but that he would be there in those all too fleeting impulses toward courageous generosity, courageous honesty, and generosity. Thank you, Ron, for being you.